A scenario that seems to crop up quite often, and this was an observation of some folks who are sometimes bidders on federal contracts, looking at the work that was done on ArriveCan, the scenario seems to be, or the conditions seem to be, that the contracts are shaped so that only specific companies could possibly qualify, a very unique or narrow capability that other companies wouldn't have, though with a broader scope they would be able to achieve the same outcome. Is that something that you've observed?
Yes, absolutely. So that we term restrictive criteria, and where it's overly restrictive, we look at several criteria. And one of the obvious criteria is, have other suppliers who are involved in the process identified the overly restrictive criteria? And if the answer is yes, has the contracting authority done anything to modify the requirement? If the answer is no, and you end up with a sole compliant bidder, then it leaves or begs the question that perhaps the criteria was overly restrictive.
What was the top complaint that you received in 2022?
In our last annual report that was reported, yes. So that restrictive criteria are biased in nature. And I can actually quote exactly, so just to make sure it's on the record. So the stakeholder felt the evaluation criteria were unfair, overly restrictive, or biased, and we had 61 total issues reported.
Do you have any insight on why someone drafting the scope of the RFP would do that?
I do. I think there's a few reasons that one could think of. One is because there's a lack of a vendor performance regime. And so you're trying ultimately to find a result in outcome, which isn't something that is very positive in nature. And that's the most dire characterization of why that might happen. On the other side, there are also instances where it's just perhaps someone who doesn't have necessarily a skill in understanding how that criteria is restrictive in nature. So in the initial attempt, without knowing that it's restrictive in nature, they draft it, only then learning that it won't actually lead to many suppliers being able to comply.
How long have you been the procurement ombudsman?
I've been the procurement ombudsman for almost 5 years.
How many recommendations have you made to the government during your tenure?
So I'll have to table that. I don't actually have that number offhand, but it's a combination because it's both procurement practice reviews and also reviews of complaint.
Another number, perhaps this one you might know offhand, and if not, I'd ask that if you could table that information as well. How many of your recommendations has the government implemented?
So again, I'll segregate by the difference between reviews of complaint and procurement practice reviews. So in procurement practice reviews, we've done a follow-up. So there's only been one follow-up, right? So I just need to take 1 second to explain the process. So when we do a procurement practice review, what we're doing is we're looking at the practices of that specific federal department. So when we make recommendations, then we allow the department 2 years to implement those recommendations. And then we return with a follow-up examination. And in that follow-up examination, we've actually developed a report card. So we're now almost there in terms of finishing the 5-year review, and then 2 years upon the review of each systemic review, then we'll be issuing a report card in terms of compliance overall with all recommendations. So the first review has found compliance with the recommendations.
Do you have any visibility on the procurement integrity regime?
So I actually started thinking about that by watching some of these OGGO committee, by watching some of the live OGGO committee, I can't think of the word, but
hearings.
Proceedings.
It's recommended watching for all
and
Canadians.
So
yeah.
it actually drew my attention to the fact that I'm not sure if I have the jurisdiction, but it's a question that I'm going to ask our legal counsel because the way we're structured, we have to be able to have jurisdiction over that specific policy in order to opine.
Yeah, I would be interested if you'd be able to report back the outcome of that advice to OGGO. If you'd be willing to do that, that'd be very helpful. I think that there's some some real questions that have been raised. You know, looking back at 2015, as you know, this is what was in place then. I think that looking at some of the media reporting on some of the contractors like McKinsey now, I think that another set of eyes on that integrity regime would be very worthwhile. Thanks, Chair. Thank you, sir.